Look, the reality is that we have had meaningfully lower tariffs for products coming in than those reciprocal tariffs exist for our products going into these other countries. That's true. And the one thing I'll say about Donald Trump is you may not agree with the tariffs, but he's been incredibly consistent. I was on YouTube yesterday and I stumbled into an interview he did, Nick, maybe you can find this, with Larry King in 1987. And he ran a full-page ad in the New York Times talking about this exact issue, and then went on Larry King and he walked through the entire trade imbalance 40 years ago.
Yeah, he's been on this, yeah.
So this is not a fly-by-night thing. So what do they want? What they want is to create the economic incentives to reshore as much industry as possible into the United States. The delicate balancing act, though, is that after 20 years of globalism and a perverted version of free trade, because it's not what it is today, it's been perverted, it is incredibly difficult to do that without these whack-a-mole problems emerging in other areas, right? Whether it's inflation or whether it's retaliatory tariffs or consumption taxes, all of these complexities, I think, are what has to get figured out. But the structural reason of why tariffs make sense is not necessarily to overly penalize one country over another, but it's simply to say, if you charge 5%, we charge 5%. If you charge 10%, we charge 10%.
Do you believe that? Do you think it's realistic now that it's a week after you do that? You actually think that can happen?
I 100% do. And
in what timeline and why?
Well, that's the key question. This is where this becomes like a first and second derivative problem. Let's just talk about it this way. When you take money out of the economy, you want to make sure you're also putting money back into the economy in another way to keep the economy stable or growing. So if you're taking money out of the economy, in the case of tariffs, you're putting money into the government's coffers. You're reducing people's spending because everything costs more now, so consumers will spend less. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that the money that you're repatriating is going back to the consumers so they can now have more money to spend. So if you increase the tariff rates, things cost more. The government is now making things more expensive. That's not good. But at the same time, if I cut your taxes and you got more money now than you did before, so you can now buy the things that you were buying, even though they're a little more expensive, the economy should be able to remain stable or grow. At the same time, if you're cutting government spending, that means that the government can afford to take less taxes in. And so they can make that assessment. So these are all, we've said it many times, these are all very related. And to Gavin's point, you've got to cut regulation at the same time so that the incremental dollars flow into things like automation, onshore production, so that the cost of things come down. And so, again, not a simple equation. I would call it a grand economic experiment. The analogy for me feels a little bit like there's 4 freight trains kind of passing by each other at very high speed, and you're trying to pass all the ingredients to make a sandwich between the windows of the freight trains. You're trying to get them all over so you can make this delicious sandwich and get to this golden age. That's the configuration that it feels like they need to kind of assess as they're iteratively doing.
They have to thread the needle is, I think, your point, and it's really hard to do. And you use the phrase experiment. Gavin, you said before, hey, don't screw up this amazing country and what we've got here. This sounds like a very high risk, high dexterity maneuver. It feels like a fighter plane, like trying to land on, a very small, aircraft carrier. Can they pull this off? Can they get to the tariffs working at the same time, inflation not spiking, not impacting employment, getting rid of people's taxes? Does this sound too complex to you and too much too fast? What is your honest thought, Gavin, as you watch this as a capital allocator? Are they going too hard, too fast, or is it worth pursuing this experiment as Friedberg framed it?